some people may wonder if it's true. Just stories, myths, fairy tales. That it's just a book, a way to control the simple-minded. That only those who don't think would follow so blindly. That if there's no proof, there's no resurrection. But here's the thing. There's more than one way to know something's true. Not because a book says it. Not because of a whim or misplaced trust. There's no physical evidence of love. How can I prove joy? I will never convince you that I was once blind, but now I see. Because I've seen the resurrection. I've seen it in a mother's comfort. I've heard it in my child's laughter. I've felt it in an embrace. I've tasted it when I enjoy a meal with friends. The resurrection isn't just something that happened 2,000 years ago. It's something that happens every time we choose family over work. Every time we choose to serve. Every time we sing that song, or we tell that story, or a life is transformed. That is why we gather. That is why we sing. That is resurrection.
So imagine you go to your mailbox and you open up a letter and find one of those really nice linen stationery letters with the name of some law firm up on top. And the letter begins to tell you that some long-lost relative of yours that you don't even know or at least remember has left you millions of dollars. Would you believe it? Would you think that that was a scam or, it's like, seriously, really, this lawyer is just trying to get me to call or some number and they're going to really try to take things from me? Would you think it was true? Well, I wonder if you'd think it was true, but it really would be awesome, right? And I think you would check it out. I'd at least think that you'd look into it. And that's kind of how I feel about the skeptics who think about Easter. That it's so wonderful, it's so amazing. Why wouldn't you at least want to check it out, even if you think that perhaps it's just a scam and it's a delusion and we're all crazy who believe in something like that? Because think about what Easter has to offer. I mean, that's really why I wanted to do this series over the next 4 weeks. Easter is. Because Easter is so wonderful, I think that I should check it out. I mean, think about it for a second. Everything that you've ever done wrong is forgiven because of Easter. That's pretty cool. Everybody gets a new body. Now, some of you are saying, that's really cool. I love that idea. And even those of you with amazing bodies, you get one that's even amazinger. I mean, imagine that you go to a place where there's no violence, no sadness, no sickness, no pain. That's something because of Easter. I mean, all of our hope of life over death is because of Easter. And it's because of that I think Easter is worth checking out. And so thus today, the first sermon in the series is Easter is real. I mean, because after all, if we're going to be talking about Easter, we probably ought to know why we believe it's true, why we believe it's real. So if you brought a Bible today or you have a device that has the Bible app on it, you can go to Southland Guest on the Wi-Fi and access your Bible. We're going to look at a letter that a guy named Paul wrote to some friends of his in a town called Corinth, 1 Corinthians. And we're going to go to chapter 15 where he gives an amazing explanation of the resurrection. You see, Here's the background on it. These guys in Corinth that he was writing to, which, by the way, 1 Corinthians, one of the oldest, if not the oldest, letter in the New Testament, it really maps out for us what's going on in terms of what first century Christians believed. But what happened is all these pretenders, these other teachers who really weren't part of the faith would come in and teach Christians their own little take on Christianity. And some of them were saying, yeah, that resurrection thing didn't really happen. He was a phantom, he was a ghost, and Paul's trying to address all of that, and he gets to the end of the letter, and he begins to spend a lot of ink and a lot of parchment on this thing called the resurrection. And it's all what we believe. So if you go to 1 Corinthians 15, I'll have it up on the screen for you in case you don't have your own Bible. Verse 3, it says this: "For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures." Now, I'm going to pause there. We're going to read more of it, but I'm going to pause there and just say, why do we believe what we just read there is true? I mean, is it just because we want to? But because we have a wish or a hope that it's true? Or is there more to it than that? Well, the fact is, if you were honest and looked into it, even a skeptic in the room, if you were honest and looked into it, you would find out that there are many reasons to believe that this is true. Many. Now, we don't have time for you to spend all day here, although some of you would say, yeah, as long as you have lunch, I'll stay here all day. But we're not going to stay all day, but I'm just going to give you a few of the reasons why at least I believe this is true, and I hope you'll come every week and hear more and more reasons. But the first reason is this: the empty tomb. The tomb is empty. You know, that's really what Paul says. Here's what's most important: the tomb is empty. Now, nothing a Christian believes matters if the tomb isn't empty. I mean, that's the fact. It's why we celebrate Easter every year. But you know what the truth is? The first century church changed worship from Saturday to Sunday, the Lord's Day, to remember the resurrection. So essentially, every Sunday is Easter. So if you only come to church on Easter and Christmas, you come every Sunday. Because every Sunday is a celebration of the Lord's Day. Why? Because the tomb's empty. It's what we're all about. We can say that the cross saves us from our sins, but actually a little later in the letter, Paul says, without the empty tomb, the cross is just stupid. He used the word futile. Futile. The cross is ridiculous if it's not for the empty tomb. That's why he says, here's the most important thing you need to understand if you're going to follow Jesus. You must have an empty tomb for anything about Jesus to matter. But that being the case then, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day, well, how can I know that that's true? How can I know this empty tomb is Jesus' empty tomb? And how can I know that the fact that the tomb is empty really matters, or that there wasn't another explanation? How can I know Easter is real? The evidence is really compelling if you'll give it an honest look and if you'll take the time to look into it. So here are some reasons I believe in the reality of the empty tomb. First, it was announced in Jerusalem, first and foremost, where an empty tomb could easily have been visited and people could have produced a body. They could have said, no, it's not empty, he's right here. But you don't have any literature from the first century, no writings from the first century that said they were able to produce a body to show this was a lie. Nowhere do you have that writing. And actually, if you look at the Jewish argument toward this whole idea that Jesus rose from the dead, both ancient writings and modern writings, you'll find out that what Matthew said the Jews were do and did do was create this lie about the body being stolen. Still, even if that is a lie, they're acknowledging the tomb is empty, right? I mean, they're coming up with an explanation for the empty tomb, meaning they acknowledge that the tomb was empty. Now, later, many Jewish writings, some believe this was in the 4th, 5th, 6th century, they seek to explain away the empty tomb. There was a Jewish writing that was very disparaging toward Jesus, called the Toledat Yeshu. And in this writing, even those authors, acknowledge the tomb was empty. And that's the reality then that we have to explain. And even current Jewish literature and current Jewish scholars who want to address the topic of Jesus Christ will attempt to address the topic of the empty tomb because they know all of the historical literature shows that the tomb was empty. Now, the point here, well, even his opponents acknowledge that they found an empty tomb. So Dr. Paul Mayer, who is a Harvard-educated professor of history from Western Michigan University, he was talking about this whole idea of his opponents finding an empty tomb, and he called it positive evidence from a hostile source. And he says this about it: in essence, if a source admits a fact that is decidedly not in its favor, the fact is genuine. Or at least the belief is that the fact is genuine. Now, understand what we're saying here. We're talking about the fact that people all over the world throughout history, believers and non-believers, opponents, proponents, all acknowledge the reality that the tomb is empty. It's empty. Why is it empty? We need more evidence for that. But the fact is, he's not there. So whatever the explanation, they all agree. Empty tomb. Now, even though that doesn't prove Jesus rose from the dead, we're here to put together a package of evidence. I'm here to give you a file and keep adding to the file. None of these things individually are going to prove to you that Jesus rose from the dead. But we're talking about a collaboration of facts for you to then evaluate. The first and most important piece of evidence, though, if you don't have an empty tomb, if you got a body in there, why look at all the other stuff, right? And so that's why we have to say it first. But here, let's put it together then with these other facts about the empty tomb. First is this, and ladies, don't get offended by this. But the first people to declare that Jesus, that the tomb was empty, that he'd risen and they'd seen him risen, the first people to declare that were women. Now, in 21st century America, you're probably saying, so? We're talking about one of the most misogynistic times in history. One of the most misogynistic cultures in history. You know, a woman's testimony wouldn't even be accepted in a court case. No women were allowed to give witness to anything and it be considered true. The personhood of women was certainly much less than it is today. And the fact that all 4 gospel writers have written the story with it's the women who Jesus appeared to first, the women who told the story of Jesus being alive first. If you were creating a deception in the first century, if you were trying to convince people of something, the last people you would have chosen to be the first ones to tell the story would be women. Sorry, ladies, that's not a reflection on you. We've grown up a lot since then. But this is the reality. The fact that the gospel accounts say that the testimony of women was how the empty tomb was revealed actually helps the authenticity of the story. It helps that it wasn't fabricated because a person wouldn't have used them to fabricate a story. Now, if you believe that, after hearing that even with the empty tomb and then the story being told, that if you believe that that's true, that these gospel writers all picked women first, and you believe that somehow doesn't help you see the resurrection, then perhaps it takes more faith believing that than it does the resurrection itself. And stay with me. Here's another thing that was a fact not only reported by the biblical writers, but by other writers in history, that a Roman guard was established at the tomb to protect from the body being stolen, because they said Jesus had declared that he would rise in 3 days. So they put a band of soldiers, it says, which is a minimum of 12 Roman soldiers. Now, just to be clear, the punishment for a Roman soldier falling asleep at the post would be death. So now a band of Roman soldiers with a seal of the Roman government is put over the stone in front of the tomb, And then the story that is told as to why the tomb is empty is that all 12 Roman soldiers fell asleep at the post. Remember, threat of death over them if they all 12. Now, if that's not enough, then the disciples or some followers came sneaking in, rolled humongous stone away from the opening of the tomb, snuck in, got Jesus, pulled him out, and took off without one of those guys waking up. Listen, I don't care if they had been drinking all night. One of them's going to wake up. And the fact is, the story is that all 12 of them declared that they had fallen asleep. They weren't put to death because they were paid off to tell this story. That's how Matthew reports it. Now, of course, other writers wouldn't include the paid off part, but they include the testimony of the Roman soldiers saying that they had all fallen asleep and didn't wake up when the body was stolen. Now, think about that. Some people say that makes perfect sense. You think, really? I mean, it almost takes more faith to believe that's true than to believe in the resurrection. And yet it gives so much corroboration to Matthew's account of the story. The only plausible explanation for the tomb being empty with a Roman guard in front of it is a resurrection, is the story as Matthew recorded it. But there's more evidence for an empty tomb. I'm going to keep going in other things here, but you can look that up yourself. But the bottom line is this: one reason that I believe Easter is real is that the tomb is empty. And the fact is, no body was ever presented. Now, keep that in mind, an empty tomb, that's the first thing. When something big happens to you, you tell that story. And so these four gospel writers, over some years of history after Jesus had ascended and the church had been founded, these four gospel writers proclaimed this story. Here's the interesting thing, though. There were also letters written. And one of the gospel writers, Luke, even began to write the story of the church, it's called. All of the people who followed this belief that the tomb is empty because they saw Jesus risen from the dead. They told everyone. They didn't even have social media, and they told everyone. And they gave their eyewitness accounts. But just like today, some people believed, some people didn't believe, for whatever their reasons were, whether they weren't confident of the facts or whether they just didn't want to become a follower of Christ and change their whole life around. Some believed, some didn't believe, but the story was still told throughout the earth for generations that the tomb was empty and Jesus had risen. But again, just an empty tomb doesn't prove the resurrection itself. Let's keep reading then in 1 Corinthians. Let's move on in chapter 15 to verse 5. And that he appeared to Cephas, and then to the 12. And after that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. And then he appeared to James and then to all the apostles. Now, I want you to keep in mind, this is not someone hundreds of years later recording what happened. This is someone in that generation talking about people who were still alive. You see, the second reason I believe Easter is true is the witness of Jesus' followers. Because the story makes it clear the lives of Jesus' followers were radically changed by something. Something changed their whole perspective on life in about an instant. Prior to Jesus' resurrection, his followers had returned to life as they knew it. That Saturday, they just went back to everything discouraged. Nothing much is happening. They even ran scared during his arrest and his interrogation and his trial and ultimately his flogging and his crucifixion. Most of them ran scared. Only one, John, stayed and cared for Jesus' mother at the cross. Peter even denied he knew Jesus while this interrogation was going on, and he was pressured by the crowd. But something happened that was extraordinary enough that Jesus' followers went public to say he had been raised from the dead. I mean, remember, we're talking about a letter written while these people were still around. Now, I have a fondness for a university in Southwest Ohio, Miami of Ohio. Most of my family went to school there, so I grew up cheering for the Red Hawks. And one of their history professors, Dr. Edwin Yamauchi, he's actually from Hawaii originally, he said this about the followers of Christ in the first century. It should be obvious that the early Christians were completely convinced of the resurrection. If this were not so, they had everything to lose and nothing to gain. By preaching the resurrection of Christ, they further antagonized the Jewish authorities and, in effect, accused them of slaying the Messiah. You see, you got to keep in mind that these writings we have are all from people who were passionate about the reality that they had seen Jesus risen from the dead. And all of them paid a great price for testifying to that. Paul even makes the point that not only did Peter and the 11 disciples publicly declare they'd seen Jesus alive after his crucifixion, he said at least 500 more witnesses could attest to it, most of whom were still alive at that time. People who saw him, people who were not changing their story, even though their lives were threatened. Anyone could have found any of these witnesses and asked them, and they would have told them. And not one ancient document, not one ancient papyrus anywhere records the testimony of anybody who had at one time declared he saw Jesus risen from the dead and then changed his testimony. Not one document did they find someone who said they'd lied about it. That's why Paul was saying in this letter to the Corinthians, he's saying, check it out for yourselves. There's plenty of people out there that can tell you all about it. Now, one of the things that I consider a great memory in my life is going to the Chillicothe Correctional Institute in Chillicothe, Ohio. Now, you're saying, wait, are you saying you went to prison? Yes, one day. It was on Good Friday. And I was fortunate that I was traveling with my boss, and he was friends with a guy named Chuck Colson, who was preaching the very first Good Friday service in an Ohio prison ever. And Chuck began to tell his own story about how he was an advisor to President Richard Nixon, and the whole Watergate affair came about, where a lot of people who were on Richard Nixon's close staff at that time went running for their own attorneys when all of this came up to protect themselves. They were going to get their own story straight, and they were going to self-preserve. Now, his point was this: if there are plenty of people who had allegedly seen Jesus risen from the dead, at least one of them would have recanted their story if it would have saved their life. And yet we don't have one that did. Colson said, I saw it with my own eyes. People whose lives were threatened or whose livelihoods or freedom was threatened all went to protect themselves and tell whatever story they needed to tell to do it. And yet here are these disciples, their families, over 500 witnesses who didn't change their story saying Jesus had risen from the dead. Many of these first century believers were ultimately martyred then for this alleged lie. Lie? Well, again, I say to you, to believe that somehow all of these witnesses could maintain their story of a lie without wanting to protect themselves, to me, believing that takes more faith than believing in the resurrection itself. Now, so the faith and martyrdom of the early followers doesn't prove the resurrection. Remember, nothing that I'm sharing with you this morning proves it by itself, but we're creating the package. Would you change your story, for instance? If you had gone out there and perpetrated a lie, would you change your story if your freedom or your life was put in jeopardy? Maybe one of you would, and we don't even have 500 in the room today. Now, one more. I just want to give you one more reason. Verse 8. And last of all, he appeared to me also, Paul, who's writing the letter. Last of all, he appeared to me also as to one abnormally born. So you see, the tomb is empty and the witness of the first century followers of Jesus, but then you have this conversion of Paul. Originally his name was Saul. And he tells the story, and you can read all about it in the book of Acts. But you might say to yourself, how does one guy's conversion prove the resurrection? Well, if you know anything about this guy, it'll start to make sense to you. You can read all about his story in the book of Acts in your Bibles in Acts chapter 9, and then his own telling of the story in Acts chapter 22 and 26. But basically, here's what happened. He was a scholar and a Jewish teacher, and probably one of those elite Pharisees, they were called. And he was the guy designated to go round up Christians and both persecute them, imprison them, and maybe come up with some trumped-up charge that the Romans would cause the Romans to execute them. This was his job. This is what he did. And so one day, he's on a donkey ride to Damascus, and out of the blue, his story is that Jesus appeared to him, and Jesus spoke to him. And he told him to get into Damascus and go to this place on Straight Street, and this guy would be there to tell him what to do. He did what he was told and ultimately was convinced that Jesus, in fact, had risen from the dead. Now you say, well, you know what? There are a lot of delusional people in the world. There's a lot of people that think they've seen something or heard voices. Sure, I get that. It's hard to believe the guy who was persecuting all the Christians in the area would be that guy, but it's possible. Remember, we're putting together a package here. After being taught about Jesus, he did a complete 180 and became the preacher, maybe the greatest preacher and teacher of Jesus Christ the world has ever known. All in a split second. Now why? Unless he had truly witnessed the risen Christ, would a persecutor of Christians totally change his beliefs about Jesus and proclaim him as the Messiah? I've concluded that he wouldn't. And why would he set himself up for beatings and ridicule and imprisonment and ultimately death if he knew it was all a lie? Again, I just look at that and say that makes absolutely no sense. Again, to believe the conversion of Paul was anything but a genuine transformation as a result of encountering the risen Christ would require more faith than believing in the resurrection itself. And that's why it comes, though, ultimately to my story and your story. Because I can lay out all of these things that the book tells us, and I can lay before you a lot of evidence. But in the end, what ultimately matters is that I myself have experienced resurrection in my own heart through a relationship with Christ. I've not only seen it with my eyes and believed it in my head intellectually, but I've also had a very personal encounter with the risen Christ. Now, my story doesn't necessarily make it true, nor the stories of millions who have trusted him and followed him throughout history. But when you put it all together, when you look at the evidence, when you look at the story of those in the first century who followed him, when you look at the story of people today who've had their own encounter with the risen Christ, you have to say to yourself, you know what? I'm at least going to be honest intellectually and check this out. Now, everybody, if you got your camera phone, get your camera phone out, because I'm going to put a picture of a book up on the screen. It's called The Case for Christ, written by a guy named Lee Strobel. Take a picture of it, then you can order it. Lee Strobel was a graduate of the University of Missouri Journalism School, one of the most respected journalism schools in the country. And then he went to Harvard Law and got his law degree and became the legal editor for the Chicago Tribune. And while living in Chicago, his wife became a Christian. And so he wanted to check this out. And he was a skeptic and considered himself an atheist. And he decided to go after all of these stories himself, like a reporter and like a lawyer. And he dug through it all, interviewed really literally hundreds of people, and ultimately came to the conclusion that this, in fact, was true. And so this book, The Case for Christ, it's an intense read. But if you're a person that likes to dig into the weeds of the details, get this book. It costs you like $4 on Amazon. $4. Some of you are saying, $4? I'm not spending $4. Yeah, $4. I mean, to give so much evidence. He's not the only author out there that's written about it either. But I'm saying here's a read where you can see there are tons of examples of why people have chosen to believe. But the evidence goes beyond the historical reality or the facts. The evidence is really intensely personal for you. See, the resurrection wasn't just so Jesus could wave his hands and prove, hey, look, it's me, God. No, the resurrection is so that every human being who's ever walked the planet and is walking the planet now can discover not only their sins forgiven, but can receive the gift of resurrection themselves. So that it's not just real in terms of history, but it's real for you. Easter is real, not just in my head, but in my heart. And I want so much for you to experience your own real resurrection today.